It is a great pleasure to introduce Professor Peter Stone, the president of the Blue Shield, who is going to present us the Blue Shield, a presentation where we are and where we've come from. It's a welcome presentation that, for that I'm inviting you to sit on the front row, the speakers, and I thank you very much, all of you, for the beautiful words that you sent us today. Peter?
Thank you very much, Una, and again, just to reiterate, thank you very much to all of the speakers, and thank you especially for speaking in English. It is something that is greatly acknowledged. Could we put the screen on full screen? Well, while we're doing that, I'm going to address that. I'm assuming I can take 10 minutes of the coffee break, but I will try only to do that. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, you can have all of the slides. Here we are. Okay, so next, please. Next, please. Okay, so I'm going to do this presentation the other way around from the title. I'm going to start talking about where we came from and then talk about what we're doing at the moment. And where we came from was the dissatisfaction of the international community at the end of 2 world wars. They were cross with the royal families of Europe for failing to stop or end quickly the First World War, a failure that led to the collapse of 3 empires. They were upset with the League of Nations that was created at the end of the First World War, primarily to stop further conflict, but primarily through diplomatic and political ends and economic ends. That failed to stop the Second World War, and so there was a new initiative to create the organization, the United Nations, which added to the portfolio of the League of Nations something that the international community had decided was missing, which was the basis of humanity's moral and intellectual solidarity. Culture was the thing that had been missing from the League of Nations and that had allowed the Second World War to take place. Next, please. But to give a little bit more context around that, we have to go to one man, Raphael Lemkin, a Polish-Jewish lawyer who had been studying conflict and especially internal conflicts since the late 1920s and early 30s. And in 1933 was the first time that Lemkin went public on a concept of a genocide convention. And Lemkin, in his original drafts of the Genocide Convention, had 2 forms of genocide: barbarism and vandalism. And barbarism was the genocide of people, whereas vandalism, which usually came before barbarism, was the vandalism and the destruction and the genocide against their cultural property, their cultural heritage. And one preceded the other. That was picked up by the international community. So senior Nazis at the Nuremberg trials were convicted for what Lemkin would have called both vandalism and barbarism. Vandalism gets in Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but down to the so-called settler nations, the US, Canada, Australia, supported by governments like the UK, former colonial powers, insisted of the removal of the chapter on vandalism from the Genocide Convention. And Lemkin was later to write that that was the most important part of the convention removed from it. But the idea was, the genie was out of the bottle. Next slide, please. And in 1953, when this gentleman, Luther Evans, the then Director General of UNESCO, opened a planning meeting and a drafting meeting for the 54 convention, he opened it with the words, "It is our objective," or it actually reads, "Let me remind you, gentlemen, that it is our objective today to lay the foundations of what I will call the Red Cross for cultural property." And over the next 3 months, the drafters actually changed that to become the organization which they then referred to as the Blue and White Shield. And they all expected that to be created as an equivalent of the ICRC, going back to Lemkin's barbarism and vandalism as the two support networks, because Evans realized that UNESCO could not do much of the practical work of protecting cultural property, either beforehand in peacetime or actually during a conflict, because UNESCO is a political organization, and UNESCO, as a result, can be swayed by the political discussions within the organization. They needed an impartial, neutral, independent organization like the ICRC, and as I say, the drafters referred that as the Blue and White Shield for obvious reasons. Unfortunately, they were disappointed. Next slide, please. And it only came 42 years later that 4 organizations, ICOM, ICOMOS, IFLA, and ICA, together worked under the drive of, unfortunately, the late Patrick Boylan. Patrick died earlier this year. But they had met each other in the Balkans and elsewhere, going to try and support that without each other knowing that the other one was going to be there. And so it was set up in 96 as a heritage organization to coordinate heritage activity in relation to cultural property protection. Next, please. The issue, which is obvious and simple, but is one that requires, or that always helps re-emphasizing, is that cultural property is going to be damaged and destroyed during armed conflict. And the stock answers to that are nothing can be done about it. You can read them. It's collateral damage in war. Protecting people is far more important. Yes, I don't disagree, but protecting people goes hand in hand, back to Lemkin, with protecting their cultural property, and so on. And that is the sort of thing that leads to the image on the slide, the looting of the National Museum in Iraq in 2003. Next slide, please. So why is it important? Cultural property gives people a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of well-being and dignity. Yes, always protect people first, but as I say, that requires protecting their cultural property, because so much of the well-being and dignity is wound up in that cultural property. And it helps to maintain our language in the Blue Shield. Ah, brilliant, thank you. Thank you. It helps to maintain and build healthy, peaceful, stable, secure, sustainable communities, the bedrock of peaceful society. It works. But a health warning. It can do that. It can be used as a means for peace and reconciliation, but it also can be used as a reason for going to war, as a target in war, as a weapon in war. And if we are trying to protect cultural property and protect people in war, we need to understand the two different scenarios that can play out there and prepare and plan for both. So what is good cultural property protection? I will just very briefly give you three examples, two of good, one of less good. A very good one, you have to go back to 1917 with the British occupation of Jerusalem. At the time, the British military were very worried that there was a 96% Islamic community in Jerusalem, and they might, the British military might be perceived as a new iteration of the Christian Crusades. And that was already the propaganda of the Ottoman Empire. So the military were worried about that. The politicians in London were even more worried about that because they saw that if the population of Jerusalem resisted the British occupation, that might spread across the whole of the Middle East, and it might spread to British India, the financial hub of the empire. And so two things happened. Firstly, Allenby, their commander-in-chief, walked into Jerusalem to show that he came in peace at some substantial risk to himself, but he walked into the city. But then secondly, the same day, he issued a proclamation where it said that all of the holy sites of all of the three main religions would be protected by his troops. And then somebody on his staff did a very simple but brilliant bit of administration by deploying Islamic troops from an Indian Army regiment under Allenby's command to protect all of the Islamic sites. As a result, there was no opposition to the British occupation of Jerusalem. It didn't spread out across the Middle East, and it didn't go to British India. And that's what we should be trying to achieve by using cultural property to avoid conflict. The next example is much closer, 2011, in the NATO bombing campaign in Libya. And led by the US National Committee of the Blue Shield, with some support from the UK, we gave a list of sites that we would prefer, if at all possible, not to be damaged during the NATO bombing. And very simply, this site, which had been identified as a NATO targeteer as a derelict building, because that's what it looked like from satellite imagery, actually the remains of a Roman fortified farm, should be attacked because there were 6 vehicles of a mobile communication communication unit of troops loyal to Gaddafi. The original plan was to use one large weapon to blow up all 6 of those vehicles at the same time and destroy the derelict building. When it became obvious that actually the derelict building was a Roman farm because of the information that we'd given to NATO, they modified the weapons to be used. And so they used 6 precision weapons and destroyed each one of the 6, and you can see one of them in the slide here, and the other 5 look like that in the same way, just a tangled bit of metal remaining. The impact of that, though, was much broader than just on this site. NATO got something that they were very unused to, a lot of good international publicity, so much so that they set up an internal inquiry as to what they'd done that was so good. And that inquiry reported and said that there should be a cultural property protection policy in NATO. We have still got to, we are still waiting for that to happen. We are still helping NATO with that. And at the moment, it is simply being blocked, to go back to Evans' concerns in 1953, because NATO is a political organization. This CPP policy is being blocked by one member state of NATO. Then the less good example, 2003 and the invasion of Iraq, led by the coalition led by the US and UK. In 2002, early 2003, there was no planning for the protection of cultural heritage in Iraq. And if there is no planning, there are no orders given to the military, and if there are no orders given to protect cultural property, as there were, for example, to the Ministry of Energy or the bank, then nothing happens. And as a result, all of the regional museums were looted. The National Museum was looted, the National Archive was looted, the National Library, most university libraries, and so on. And that failure to understand the importance of heritage, which was so clear and evident in 1917 by a military, caused not only real damage and looting, but in 2006, the destruction of the Al-Aqshiri Mosque in Samarra, one of the 3 most important Shia Islamic sites in the world. And as a result of that, that tipped an increasingly belligerent population, hoping that the coalition troops would go home, into the full-scale sectarian civil war, which lasted for another 5 years or more. And that meant that Western politicians and senior military staff thought that the coalition troops should stay in Iraq for that length of time. And they not only took 5 years' worth of casualties and fatalities, but worse, in my mind, if it can be worse, they took 5 years of losing the propaganda war. And by losing the propaganda war, the media war, they allowed for the reemergence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they provided the oxygen for the emergence of the so-called Islamic State. And that is not entirely down to the failure to protect cultural property, but that was certainly a key leg of the stool that collapsed. So, created 42 years late, the Blue Shield now envisages itself as a triangle within a circle, okay? And the 3 points of the triangle are not just the heritage community. The heritage sector is there as one of those 3 points. But equally important is the uniform sector, what we refer to, so not only the armed forces, but police and customs and emergency services, and then the humanitarian sector. Because all 3 will be deployed to a greater or lesser extent in any conflict. And if they work together, there is much stronger possibility of protecting cultural property. And within the space in that triangle, as put to me by a US colonel a couple of years ago, "Oh, I get it, sir, there are no stupid questions in that triangle." And he got it entirely right, because it's where they can mediate their objectives by using cultural property protection to make attaining those objectives easier. And that's the same for all parts of the triangle. But in the outer circle, there is the context in which each different conflict takes place. And that's the political context, the legal context, who has ratified what convention, etc. And then the media context, are we going to have a debacle as in 2003, 2006, and then up to 2011, as we did in Iraq. We are now established as an NGO under Dutch law. This slide is now out of date as of last week. There are now 34 national committees, and we still have limited funding for the Blue Shield since 2017 as part of, and this is why I have both the logos on these slides, as part of the University of Newcastle's contribution through the UNESCO Chair in Cultural Property Protection and Peace at Newcastle. We are what Luther Evans wanted back in '53, an independent, impartial, neutral, non-for-profit organisation. And we talk to everybody. Anybody who is involved in a conflict, we will talk to. So I talk, yes, to the Ukrainian side, but also to the Russian Federation. We have talked to the Taliban, and we work with anybody who is willing to protect cultural property. Some of those conversations are shorter than some of the others, but we will not talk to people. Again, something that UNESCO simply cannot do. And we will take our teams to where colleagues from UNESCO will not be allowed to go, going back to Evan's underlining the need for this different organisation. So our end goal is, as I've said, healthy, peaceful, stable, secure communities. And the image there is me with a very beautiful hat on, but training and working with two different groups in Lebanon. Those people who got blue hats on are the United Nations peacekeeping deployment in Lebanon, UNIFIL. And the guys without any hats on are the Lebanese army. And we started working with the two and the DGA in Lebanon and Blue Shield Lebanon and an NGO called Biladi in 2013. And I'll come to this later briefly, but it was because of those 7 years of training and partnership and building trust that following the massive explosion at the port in 2020, all of those partners worked together to help clear up and secure a number of buildings and streets in Beirut. So our primary context, yes, is the Hague Convention, but more broadly, we work under UN and UNESCO charters and declarations, but we also think of the disaster risk reduction side of natural or human-made disaster as well. So we go further than the 54 Convention. And Blue Shield International provides a framework for all of the now 34 national committees to work. And I'm not going to read all of those out, but we ask, well, Blue Shield International every year plan to and report on these 6 areas. And we ask all national committees to do the same thing. But we don't tell the national committees they have to do those in this priority order. They can change the order down to their local circumstance, and they can perhaps only do 2 of those 6 because they don't have the resource to do more. But it shows a commonality across the 34 national committees who are in each of the 5 inhabited continents. And in the image, you see our colleague Michael de la Cruz actually putting this into practice in the field in Ukraine. We also have identified 8 different threats to cultural property. So it's not just collateral damage for this reason. And again, you can see all of these different threats. And you can see on the right-hand side, members of the Blue Shield France Committee who have just been awarded a status of emergency responders by the French government so that they can enact all of the work as listed on the left-hand side of the slide. We have numerous partnerships with, for example, NATO, UNESCO, the ICRC, Smithsonian, the UN Peacekeeping Force in Lebanon, and many others. One of which, in the last year, is the Gyeonggi Cultural Foundation in South Korea. And we're working in particular with that organization because they are the organization that is responsible for trying to develop an understanding of the, in the first instance, the southern part of the demilitarized zone between South and North Korea as a potential World Heritage Site based on reconciliation and peace. And so we've been working with the foundation, and we will continue to do that until we hope a nomination goes in, or it gets onto a tentative list and a nomination goes in the, we hope, foreseeable future. I'm just going to rush through some activities of national committees. And you'll get a lot more information of this in the annual report, which will soon be on the Blue Shield website. So Blue Shield Chechnya is meeting with the Ministry of Culture to discuss the basic rules of cultural property protection, looking at those 6 areas of activity, trying to deliver. Curacao is developing a focal point and an open source mapping, alarm and monitoring tool following a training workshop done conjointly with the Smithsonian and the Cultural Heritage Monitoring Lab. Guatemala was publishing warning bulletins among cultural institutions following the unrest and looting in the center of Guatemala City. So all of that activity just taking place in the last 12 months. Unfortunately, something else that happened in the last 12 months is the sad death of Babacar Niande, president of the Blue Shield in Senegal. Babacar was an archivist and had worked tirelessly throughout his career and very surprisingly and very quickly unexpectedly passed away in August of this year. So our condolences to colleagues in Senegal. But also our condolences in Senegal because there were violent political demonstrations in June of last year, and 20,000, just as one example of that, 20,000 student files from 1957 to the present day were burnt and damaged. And you can see one of our colleagues, Hamadi Gay of Blue Shield Senegal, walking through the destroyed process. But Hamadi, quite a lot of the files were just strewn around the campus and thrown anywhere, and they have been working on bringing all of that together and hopefully a digitization process of the remaining physical archives. Blue Shield France, I've said they've got this national status now for emergency response. I can't resist this. They have come up with this brilliant teaching tool, again, Blue Shield France, of Blue Shield in Playmobil. And it works beautifully. I've seen it in action in workshops, and it's a great tool. Blue Shield Germany have built on activities done by others in Germany, but are now showing the value of this essentially porter cabin, which is full of information and documentation, cleaning and general packing of objects that can be deployed on the back of a small lorry anywhere in Germany or elsewhere. And Blue Shield Germany are doing seminars and raising awareness of the full stop there, but of the container. Blue Shield Turkey, and this is from the Deputy Director General of Cultural Assets and Museums from the Ministry of Culture and Tourism in Turkey, thanking the Blue Shield for their work in Turkey following the devastating earthquake, again, of last year. And this isn't just helping to clear up, it is doing some very impressive and detailed GIS work to map the damage and to begin, through that mapping process, to begin to start the planning of the rebuilding and the restoration of many of these buildings damaged, or the historic buildings damaged in that earthquake. So some fantastic work going on there in Turkey. Austria, Blue Shield Austria helped the then Armenian National Committee that was under construction by training young people in Armenia about cultural property protection and the work of the Blue Shield. And here are some just mapping one historic building, a church there in Armenia. The Armenian National Committee is now the 34th of our current national committees. They have become a real full committee. Iceland running handling workshops on behalf of Reykjavik City Museum for the city museums and libraries in August of last year. This fantastic work going on across all 34 of the national committees is a real testimony to the strength and the packaging of what Blue Shield can do at a national level. Blue Shield Korea pulled together a hybrid conference on the preservation of cultural heritage in times of war. Those are the people who were actually in the room, but there were, I think, 4 times that number from not only the Republic of Korea, but from the region who attended in hybrid fashion of that conference. And in the middle there, an ex-board member of Blue Shield International, Professor Kidong Bai. Blue Shield Mali, meeting with the relevant minister in the government to again push those 6 areas of activity and push the collaboration, the partnership, but also push the government to make sure that they are doing everything that they can do to actually deliver good cultural property protection. And again, Mali, on African World Heritage Day in May of last year, here at Timbuktu, pushing out to the general public, raising awareness of the work that is needed to protect cultural property. Because if you wait until a conflict starts, it is too late, as unfortunately our colleagues in Ukraine have found to their detriment. You have to plan for this in peacetime, and that is a message that we cannot repeat frequently enough. So just a couple of areas that we are working through with Blue Shield International over the last few years. We now work under a formal action plan with NATO that has, we're trying to get them to develop a CPP template for information that can go into all NATO deployments. We do a lot of what they call injects, problems into NATO exercises. So after this, Emma doesn't go home, but goes to Norway to work at the Joint Warfare Centre in Norway on one of these exercises, putting cultural property issues in the way of the carefully prepared military plans, and how those people react to that builds an understanding and an awareness of the value and the legal need for cultural property protection by any NATO deployment. And we're, as I say, trying to help them with the development of a cultural property protection policy, but being a political organisation, again going back to Luther Evans' aspiration in 1953 to take protection out of the politics and just getting something done. We work now on an annual basis with the UN Peacekeeping School in Ireland, and also with the multinational, I'm trying to remember the acronym, Multinational Training Centre for Peacekeeping Support Operations in Kilkis in Greece, every year talking about the value of cultural property protection and awareness on all UN peacekeeping and European peacekeeping missions, and building it up there. And this is me in the last days of mask wearing for COVID, training on the UN School in Ireland course. And we're developing generic training materials that will be available at some point for as many peacekeepers as we can. And one of our aspirations is to roll this out to many of the other UN peacekeeping schools around the world, but at the moment we don't have the staff time or whatever to do that. And we're also developing MOUs, as I say, with the humanitarian sector, and we've got the MOU with the ICRC, the last thing we did before COVID lockdown, and Emma goes, in fact, from Norway to Geneva before we allow her to go home to work with an ICRC project on the digitization and identification of Blue Shield signage. So all of that goes on. We are working, led by our colleague Michael de la Cruz, with Ukraine, and there are three main areas that we're working on. Developing a national committee of the Blue Shield in Ukraine. We were talking to colleagues in Ukraine about that in the end of 2001. Unfortunately, that got overtaken by events, but we're back there. We're talking to different parts of the Ukrainian armed forces about how they can work and get a capability as required under Article 7 of the Hague Convention within their military, and that is beginning to happen. And we also looked and were there on the ground over the last 18 months or more, looking at a feasibility study, and no more than that, but of the possibility of collecting evidence for the specific targeting of cultural property sites in a battlefield situation. And we looked at satellite imagery, and from satellite imagery we identified, I think it was 20 sites that we wanted to send a team in to look at on the ground. I think we managed, my memory isn't very good, but I think it was 15 of the sites we actually managed to get to. And of those, only 2 showed good evidence, had it been collected at the right time and in the right manner, of specific targeting. So, yes, there is a lot of damage happening, but to cultural property, but in terms of specific targeting by the Russian Federation, we've only so far identified 2 sites that perhaps could be taken to a national or international court at some point in the future. And this shows you the sort of interesting situation and the complexity of the situation. So as I said before, that we talked to both the Ukrainians and the Russian Federation. And talking to the Ukrainians, of course, and most Western viewpoint, that there is good evidence of the Russian Federation removing, looting is a word usually used, material from 2 museums in the area, fighting and in the area under Russian Federation control. Of course, the Russian Federation view of that is that they are clearly abiding by the 1954 Convention because they are removing that to a safe place within the country as defined by the Russian Federation, so into the Crimea, and there are 2 very different political perceptions of a conflict and how that impinges on how the 54 Convention is interpreted, and that impinges on direct military activity on the ground. We're raising awareness, and I'm here, and one of the images down there is my, I think, first visit to Romania, but we've done a lot of work elsewhere. And since 2017, when we started getting a little bit of funding, we've done over 50 presentations in, I think these figures are slightly out of date now, but at least 27 different countries. And we have got projects going on at the moment, or one just finished, in Iraq and Syria, again, where a UNESCO team would simply not be allowed to go. And so we're there on the ground, helping colleagues on the ground trying to protect cultural property and trying to collect evidence of what's been going on. So what's standing in the way? One of the things that's in the way is a lack of understanding across the board that all of this is important. And I show you again an image of the area of Beirut damaged by the huge explosion in August 2020. But there in the image, you see staff from the Blue Shield. I don't know if this... No, it doesn't work. But the guy with his back to you, you can just make out a blue shield on the back of his blue jacket. But he's working with troops from both the UN peacekeeping deployment and the Lebanese armed forces in carefully collecting up the rubbish that relates to particular buildings, or not the rubbish, the damaged material that relates to particular buildings. So in much of the area damaged by the explosion, all of this was just pushed along the street by a bulldozer and put in one big pile and then taken away. What we were doing in the areas that we could get to was actually trying to maintain a relationship between the rubble and the original building. So that's the sort of thing that we want to achieve. The biggest problems. Firstly, the main responsibility, although there is an awful lot of responsibility through Article 7 on the armed forces, lies with the Ministry of Culture, and those globally tend to be the smallest, least funded ministries in any government. Second one is that everybody is blinkered. They do not want to plan for the worst, and that's understandable. And it's also understandable that given the fact that most culture ministries don't have much money, you want to prioritise. And the prioritisation of long-term protection in the event of something as catastrophic as an armed conflict is not something that people want to think is ever going to happen to them. So there is a big concern there. I always say that there are probably only 2 countries in the world that come close to actually implementing the 54 Hague Convention properly. The first of those is the Swiss. Why? Because they always do. When the Swiss commit to something, they do it, and with bells and whistles. The other is the Republic of Korea, because the Republic of Korea lives on a daily basis with an immediate and present threat just to the north of them, North Korea. And so they plan very clearly every year. The whole civil service closes down for 3 weeks with no holiday, and they plan for damage or destruction or attack across the board, and building the partnership. And until President Trump was actually in office, that included the active participation of the American 8th Army stationed in the Republic of Korea. So the issue of UNESCO being a political organization is there, and we were founded 42 years late and still not properly funded. So I just throw that out in case anybody's got any money. What we aspire to do over the next period until 2029 is in our fundraising plan, is to try and develop our work and expand our work. So we want to do the training materials for the humanitarian sector, in particular the ICRC's armed conflict and security delegates. And we've had a draft set of training materials tested, and we're hoping to go back and get those better. We want to move that UN training course that we deliver in Ireland and in Greece to as many of the other, and I think it's something like 36 UN training schools around the globe. We want to build on our relationship with NATO, but in the same way with the African Union, the ASEAN countries, the Rio Pact, etc. We need to build that and become less Eurocentric. We need to have better and more effective reactions to many of the conflicts that we only scratch the surface of. So we've been in, as I say, Iraq and Syria and Ukraine recently, but we haven't yet managed to get to Yemen. We are working with colleagues in Sudan, and we hope to be able to attract funding to actually have a team on the ground in Sudan in the near future. And we want to increase the representation in the rest of the world. It's there. We have odd national committees spread around, but it's not going to happen in my lifetime. But I look forward to the time when there were 196 national committees globally, because then we will have achieved something. Then we will be a real partner at the table. And those are just the highlights of what we want to achieve. This year is the 70th anniversary and the 25th anniversary, and we have got a significant fundraising option going this year. We haven't as yet got commitments, although this morning I got an email which, before I'd opened it, really excited me. It still excites me because it's from one of those countries that we have been talking to, and they were apologising for the long delay in getting back to us, but they are working on trying to source the funding in their country. So one of the things that we are told by a number of countries is they can't be the first, but if somebody else becomes the first, then they will join into the process. We had one country who wanted to set up and fund my real aspiration, which we've got